Russia's ability to feed gas at a cheap price to Europe was bothersome. Biden wants to go to war, I think, in some unconscious way with Putin. He wants to mix it up with the Russians. One thing I can tell you about presidents, they have noted that the presidents like Lincoln and Roosevelt, who win wars, become famous presidents, great presidents. So they always have that itch. And particularly a president at war always gets better ratings than a president not at war. The agency, a group in the covert world, was assigned a mission. We want to do something to convince Putin to back down. The question being asked of the White House, do you want something reversible, like sanctions, or something irreversible? And the word came back, irreversible. That means kinetic. So the option was, of course, take out the pipelines. Why not?
So the U.S. made a conscious choice to also communicate to Europe that, guess what? Our political aims are more important than you and our alliance, which is NATO, which we're supposed to all stick together. In this case, it's not. And we want to let you know we're willing to do these things. So they let Putin know and Germany know.
You just said it in 2 sentences. I do believe he does not want to conquer Western Europe. I don't believe he wants to retake Germany. I don't believe he wants anything more. He wants this buffer, this Ukrainian buffer. I wouldn't mess with the guy. He's going to win this war.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs, sharing our vulnerability, overcoming our fears, transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Seymour Hersh, the investigative journalist, political writer, and author. You first gained widespread recognition in 1969 for exposing the My Lai massacre and its cover-up during the Vietnam War. From there, you went on to cover the Watergate scandal for the New York Times and also reported on the secret U.S. bombing of Cambodia. In 2004, you detailed the U.S. military's torture and abuse of prisoners at Abu Ghraib in Iraq, while in 2015, you asserted that the Obama administration had lied about the death of Osama bin Laden. For your work, you've received the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting, a record 5 George Polk Awards, and 2 National Magazine Awards. Just recently, you published an article claiming that the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines was carried out by the U.S. Navy, the CIA, and the Norwegian Navy under the direct order of President Biden. Seymour, welcome to London Real.
I'm glad to be here.
Great to have you. It seems like you have become super internet famous in the past week, as independent media like ourselves is really curious about this story, while mainstream media like the New York Times, Washington Post, and everybody else has completely ignored it. I'm curious if we could just dive into it, Seymour. What happened with Nord Stream? Why does it matter?
The bombing of Nord Stream really matters because it happened last fall, late September. And at that point, Joe Biden, my president, was pushing very hard. As you know, he just had this, one-on-one with Putin in speeches, very aggressive, very hostile, and tensions are ratcheting up. And what he did, the intelligence community is interesting because many people in the intelligence community, I know it's hard to say this, they take the oath of office, which they take is to the Constitution. Not to the president, not to their boss. And those are the people over the years that I'm 300 years old, man. And so after all these years, I know a lot of people that ended up as 4 stars in all sorts of places and ended up being involved in some of the most complicated stuff in the government. And so pretty much have a sense of what to do and not to do. So I heard about this story a month after it happened. Nobody came to me with it. I asked about it with somebody I knew who was inside. And so what it was is Biden wants to go to war, I think, in some unconscious way with Putin. He wants to mix it up with the Russians. I don't know why, but one thing I can tell you about presidents, they have noted that the presidents like Lincoln and Roosevelt who win wars become famous presidents, great presidents. So they always have that itch. And particularly a president at war always gets better ratings than a president not at war. Poor Bill Clinton, when he got into office, had issued a demand about gays in the military, and he was being ridiculed. Don't ask, don't tell. And he's just being embarrassed because he has supported that position. Very unprogressive America at that time on gay issues. And so in May or June of the first year, 6 months in office, he ordered the bombing of Baghdad. First major bombing of a major city in the Middle East by us ever. And it was the best day he's ever had. The next day he went to church, reported. It was a Saturday he did the bombing. Sunday he had reporters all over. It was a great day for him. So, that's just the way it is. That's just the way we respond. And so I'm just giving you sort of the heuristic approach. I don't know what really was in his mind. I have a guess. But about so late in Christmas of 2021, before that, in December, it definitely looked like Putin was going to go to war. He'd had it with the Ukrainians. He thinks they're sort of sub-level anyway. Some people might remember from the history books in the early 1930s, Russia let 22 million people starve in the Ukraine. Just took all the grain from them and they just died. They've always treated it as a subculture. And we've never really been big fans of Ukraine, NATO in particular, because of the corruption there.
Right.
And also the fact that a significant body of the leadership, even as late as now, or before this war, wore Nazi insignias. There was a lot of that crazy stuff going on there. Really, but on the other hand, Kiev was a fun city to visit with a lot of good restaurants, etc. And so the agency, a group in the covert world, was assigned a mission in December. We want to do something to convince Putin to back down. And we're yipping and yelling by the president. Wasn't doing it. He was building up the forces. And so the term of art I use is important because anybody on the inside knows I know something. The words used were the group assembled, NSA, CIA, not the FBI, I don't think, Treasury Department, State Department, all the people who could contribute either funding or what you will. They started meeting in a secret room in a building across the executive office building, which is on the White House grounds, but it's separate. It's where they hide most of the executive offices are there. They started meeting, and the question being asked of the White House through intermediaries, this is the president, do you want something reversible like sanctions or something irreversible? And the word came back, irreversible. That means kinetic. So the option was, of course, take out the pipelines. Why not? Threaten to. Because since the Kennedy days, there's been a lot of worry as the Cold War went on and we had this crazy notion of containment. We could contain communism. In the Kennedy days, even the Kennedy days on, Russia's ability to feed gas at a cheap price to Europe was bothersome because gave Russia what you could call, what this White House did call weaponizing gas. That's what they were worried about. Russia was using weaponizing gas. And the fear was we have to hold Germany and NATO, who get a lot. They have no natural resources there in Western Europe. And they were being supplied for a dozen since 2011, when the first pipeline, Nord Stream, there's two pipelines. The first one was built, began pumping an enormous amount of gas at an incredibly cheap price, building up the German engine. The largest chemical company in the world, BASF, is there. And we have all those automobiles, the fancy cars that we all love in America. The world loves it, Mercedes, etc. And so what to do about that? That was always a problem. So the war starts, and we're pushing, NATO's involved, we're pushing Western Europe, and the Germans, we want more tanks, planes, guns, etc. And at some point, and so the idea was, give them this option, but once the war started, the people in the field, and they went to Norway because the Norwegian sailors, I actually published a piece today about Norway's role in Vietnam. Norway had a huge role in building up the Vietnam attacks we made against the North before the war was even declared.
And then
And
Norway and the U.S. always have had a close relationship. They were the first one to join NATO in '49, and
got it.
it's very close. And they have
Very close.
high
Very
level
hostile to Russia,
Navy
too.
and underwater crews as well.
Well, and also don't forget they have 1,400 miles of ocean, all the way. Norway goes 1,400 miles from European Oslo, all the way up to the Arctic Circle, where they run into Russia.
Right.
And so we have built in the last decade, we have put up the most advanced synthetic aperture radar. They cost hundreds of millions, if not more, radar to monitor the Russian nuclear weapons fields across the mountains in Russia, northern Russia, Kola Peninsula. Really cold up there. Anyway, and so we built bases. We've added to their air force. We work closely with their navy, and of course, we worked very closely with them in the early stages of the Vietnam War. We were running Navy SEAL teams and operations long before the war began. I mean, we were working against the North, and doing a lot of aggressive stuff that wasn't long before anybody in America knew much about the war. That Kennedy has sort of pushed too. Anyway, that's all ancient history. It's a place that fits because they keep their mouth shut.
Right.
And I was unfair to them. In the story I wrote, I said they made profit. They did make a good profit because the price of gas has gone up, but the amount of gas they ship to Western Europe has only risen about 3-4% since this the pipeline was shut down. The price of gas, though, has made their profit doubled. So the price right now, even though it's been a warm winter, people are paying. It's 3 to 4 times as much in Italy, 5 times as much in France for electricity, and power plants are generated by oil, and so the price is going up, and so anyway, so these guys are watching this. The guys that did it, I mean, and they do, as I say, they take the oath of office to the Constitution, not to the president and not to their commanding officer. These are tough guys. They like to do stuff that makes sense to them. So they did plant the bombs. They were ready to go. They could go at any time, but Biden said no. They initially got it done in June. He said no then. And then by July, August, with the war on, they thought it's okay. Late September, he orders the hit. They do it.
Right. So they go in June because we're running a NATO exercise. So they came up with a plan. They had the cover. They got the divers in there. But then Biden said, I want to make it contingent, right? So he could do it by remote control later, which was a little bit challenging for them, but they found a way to do that.
It was a lot more challenging than I actually wrote about because for a lot of reasons. One is, of course, when you communicate to bombs that are set to be triggered by a signal sent by a sonar, it's low frequency because the water burns up high frequency. It's low and slow. And it's, the way you do it, to make it really simple, when you're a kid, you probably played these games, knock, 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 knock. It's like 3 knocks and 2 little ones. So it's a pulse that triggers, the sonar reads it, the sonar goes, triggers the pulse, which triggers the bombs. And this stuff, we're talking about stuff that can blow up a major goddamn high-rise, big office building in New York. And, it's real C4 maxed out, it's really a powerful bomb. The pipeline's covered by steel, and it's also covered by concrete, because otherwise you don't want the salinity in the water, even though Baltic's much less salty than the Atlantic. It's still salty. You don't want it to eventually corrode. So it's a big project to blow it up. The problem, anyway.
And you have to hide the bombs so they're not visible by any Russians coming to inspect. Oh
yeah, you have to. First, they're built underground, but anyway, some of them go underground. But basically, Russians have underwater submarines, unmanned submarines spying, and they can detect something strange. And I don't know. I do know the details. Would have taken about 3 books to get it done. And so they actually reached putting it there once to go off in 48 hours. You put a timer on it. If a miner's down there, if a diver's down there and he sets the bomb, he's not going to set it for 10 minutes because it takes him a little while to get out of there, and it's going to blow sky high. So they have a 24-hour, 48-hour timer they put automatically. You don't have to trigger it. It's going to go in 2 days. But the White House nixed that, not knowing the complications. And then you have a big period of how long did they wanted to stay underwater? 1 day, 3 days, 3 months, and so there was a lot of problems about it. This I didn't write about it. They had to go to all the major laboratories that the Navy has. And by the way, when you say Navy, you're right. But I will tell you, everybody on that project from the Navy was TDY, that temporary duty. The Pentagon didn't know. Their bosses in the Pentagon did not. I'm turning off my phone. Hold on.
So the Pentagon didn't know, but
So
the CIA.
so they had to go. Actually, they went to a country called England, which seems to do a lot about underwater stuff, to get help on how to fix it. They did fix it. They made it so it could go off. And then the president decides to do it in late September. By this time, if you remember last summer, it looked like Ukraine had won a great victory. They were rolling through. The Russians fell back. Well, it turned out, as the fall went on, at the best you could hope for by late fall would be a stalemate, that maybe you can get through the winter and do some serious negotiation, and maybe you can get Russia to back off a little bit on Crimea, not likely, but on some of the provinces that are, the provinces, Donbass, that are in play. So when they popped it, here's the thinking that I get. Biden decided to blow Nord Stream 2, which was controlled by Germany. The first one, Putin had already shut down the first one in anger, off the rhetoric. The second one was still there, ready to pump. It had been built, it had been constructed. He shut it down. The Germans shut it down. And the fear was Germany was getting anxious about the war. There were so many economic demands. There were also, there was also pressure from Western Europe. And there were questions being raised about what are we doing? Are we going to, there was a lot of fear that they were going to end up in a protracted war with Russia that they would not win. And so Biden's fear was that Schultz would say, the hell with this. I got winter coming. I want the gas. I don't want my people, my companies to go dry this winter. He would do the political thing and open up the pipeline. So he took that option away from him. And let me tell you what that means. I don't do politics. Politicians call me. There's a lot of stuff going on in Germany now in the Bundestag and their parliament about this. A lot of concern about this decision. What he did is he told Europe, all right, since World War II, you guys are dependent on it. We had your back, really good. But in this case, we value more trying to stand up to Russians more than you. So be cold and have your industry slow down. And right now you have the biggest, as I mentioned, BASF talking to China about maybe, doing some business there, moving some things there, because they don't have the gas costs too much. The biggest corporations in the world, that is the biggest chemical company, is looking forward to a lousy next winter. Over between September and October in the fall, it was a very mild winter. They built up stocks so that winter came, they could get through this winter. They will get through it, even though prices have gone up. And I think the Bundestag, the temperature's kept at 60 degrees. A lot of people there are wearing, their ski underwear. I assume everybody in Germany skis. Why not? I would if I were there. Anyway.
So the U.S. made a conscious choice to also communicate to Europe that, guess what? Our political aims are more important than you, and our alliance, which is NATO, which we're supposed to all stick together. In this case, it's not. And we want to let you know we're willing to do these things. So they let Putin know and Germany know.
You just said it in 2 sentences. That's okay. That's what the thinking of the people involved. And that's probably why I was learning as much as I did, because there was a sense that the president had sort of misused a very significant element. And there, look, I've been talking to people that came out. I did a story about a My Lai massacre. It was 18 months afterwards. Nobody wanted to publish it. Nobody believed the story. There were polls done when I published the first story in some not left-wing, just a magazine, a newspaper that had American correspondents who knew Vietnamese, called Dispatch, but nobody was paying much attention to it. I couldn't get a major, even though I had been around. Anyway, I can't tell how hard it was to not only have interviewed the guy, Kelly, that they charged, and have a copy of the charge sheet, and still not get a major paper to prove it. It's not like, in this case, I don't have a document. And so I get so many people that ask me, well, how can you prove it? And I said, I had the same thing after My Lai. I didn't have a video of it. I don't have a video of these guys under the water digging around, but that's a crazy standard, because I eventually went to work for the New York Times, I got the first real writing job I got after doing Me Life was at the New Yorker, the best magazine in the goddamn world at the time. I went and saw the editor, William Shawn. Everybody said, he won't even talk to you. Within 5 minutes, he hired me. And I did stuff for him for a couple of years. And then the editor of the New York Times, Abe Rosenthal, was very conservative, but damn it, he liked stories. And he hired me and he let me go. He said, just go. And I wrote stuff. I wrote about the CIA spying on American students. I wrote about the CIA going after Allende. I wrote some NSA stuff that I don't have to brag about because in principle, I like the idea of having intelligence collection. I didn't like them turning on us. That's what they did at one point. The CIA began to spy on American citizens.
Yeah.
And they're too good to do that. They got stopped, and that led to the famous hearings, the Church Committee, the first time the Senate tried to do something. And by the way, it's no shock to me that the Democratic Senate, led by Chuck Schumer, I haven't heard a word from anybody. There hasn't been a word said in Congress about this.
Yeah, so let's talk about the reaction to this piece, because first of all, the mainstream media haven't picked it up at all. The White House press secretary denied it, I think, when they were asked by reporters afterwards, or they went out of their way of denying it when they weren't even asked. There's been some Republicans in Congress that are now asking around saying, wait a second, if this was covert, shouldn't we have been notified? What has been the reaction? What surprised you about that? What hasn't surprised you?
Well, I know that if you want to get away from the story, and when I did stuff, I mentioned the story I did on the CIA spying completely contrary to their every law set in the books. They were never supposed to touch anything like that in America.
Yeah.
I told the New York Times, I've been working on it for 2 years. I told my editor 2 days before, I wrote 7,000 words in the paper with 7 unnamed sources, okay? And nobody called up and said, who are the sources? They'd asked me earlier and they learned who they were. So on this story, they ran it all over the front page. And that's the power of the Times, which isn't being used now. But now you use the fact that I'm not naming a source.
My name is Jim Rickards. I'm a former advisor to the CIA, Department of Defense, and the White House. In a moment, you'll have my own evidence that very few people have seen. You'll see how I believe 2 acts of democratic stupidity are about to combine into a storm that will change America forever, the American Energy Armageddon. In fact, due to specific circumstances created by the Armageddon, it's possible you could now win big while others lose. You see, there's a universal truth. In times of crisis, money moves. During the coming energy Armageddon, most Americans will face new hardships, but not all. A few will win and win big. You're about to see how the energy Armageddon could create a one-time opportunity to secure new substantial wealth. If you want in, keep watching. Right now, today, America is running out of gas, diesel, and oil. Our national fuel reserves are down 50% or more from where they should be. It's so urgent, major suppliers are calling it a code red emergency. We don't have the refining capacity to catch up, and we're shipping most of what we have to Europe to bail them out of Calamity Joe's Nord Stream crisis. We're now facing catastrophic fuel shortages I predict will collapse our nation's energy grid. When it happens, every citizen will see firsthand the Dems' obsession with green energy is a scam. In fact, I'm going to show you my evidence that outs them as shameless hypocrites. That's not all. I predict this storm will bring about a new social order to our country. Many who are now rich will find their accounts drained, and those who are poor will turn to desperate measures to survive. I'm talking about civil unrest, a massive crime wave, and violence in our streets. Most will suffer under Biden's energy Armageddon, but not everyone. Some good Americans will win. They'll take advantage of wealth-building opportunities created by the upheaval, which I'll reveal here today, to vastly improve their personal economic situation. And that's the most important thing I want to share with you. Now, if the idea of winning while others suffer makes you uncomfortable, no problem. Then this presentation is not for you. But the way I see it, our great nation was built during times of crisis when a few smart people recognized opportunity and seized it. If you see the storm coming, if you know Calamity Joe and his ilk are steering us straight into it, and you want to not just survive, but thrive by using the crisis potentially to grow your personal wealth, then you're exactly who I want to reach today. Give me about 3 minutes of your time. I'm going to show you everything right now.
I can't even say anything that I've learned that puts anybody in a room, because one thing we're good at is finding out people who might be talking. You know what I mean? At this point, anybody could know from the source, but I've got a long track record. That they walk away from this one has to do, I think, with the polarization of the press that maybe Trump started. Trump came in, and you either liked him or you didn't like him. We soon had Fox News and the New York Post and other papers who were more, I guess, to the right, more conservative, and then you had the liberal press in total opposition. So it was and it stayed because it's a Democrat in power. The Democratic Senate's not going to touch it. The Republicans own the House. The one guy the one guy that seems to be way out there, who's quite bright, is Jim Jordan, who's chairman of a committee. Jordan's really, I've watched Jim run. He was head of a subcommittee in the House at one point, and he ran hearings on very complex money issues. A lot of money issues, and he understands things. He does his homework, but he's caught up in trying to find out what's going on with Hunter Thompson, the son. That sort of peripheral issue. Why they're not looking at this more seriously? You mentioned that there's some talking, but there's been no serious action taken to find out. And let me tell you something. About the power of the White House. This happens on the 26th of September. He stiffs Europe, basically, and 4 days later, there's a news conference, and the press corps. Jake Sullivan, who's the National Security Advisor to the president, one of the gaggle that was always for expanding NATO during his career. That's been one of his things. So Sullivan gives a briefing, and finally somebody asks him about the pipeline that blew up, and he does the thing. Well, we don't know anything, but he says very carefully, very interestingly, but Denway and Normark are going to be looking at it, and we'll, of course, we have no idea. It looks like the Russians did it. The Russians are behaving in the ways they do, dropping that stuff, the usual stuff. And no reporter seems to know what the president had said, the threat he'd made earlier. That isn't mentioned, because that's pretty important in my version of the story. Anyway, and he says there's going to be an investigation. The Swedes and the Danes are doing an investigation. So, okay, we got an answer. A month later, the Swedes and Danes, after their investigation, guess what they report? They concluded something happened underground. There was an explosion that probably was sabotage. That was their conclusion a month later. It's comical, really comical. And meanwhile, and so here's the president of the United States. He has the power to do something to send out something called a tasking order. The president can task the community, and he's got a lot of options. We have something called the Office of National Intelligence, which is the poobah. They're in charge of all of it, the known and the unknown and the down and dirty. And they have a director of intelligence who has the charge to do any investigation. He's not asked to do anything. There's also the CIA, which has a directorate of intelligence, which puts out a lot of superb stuff. All the machinations of the agency. Its intelligence is usually, it can sometimes be tilted, but a lot of times it's quite brilliant and very straightforward, particularly when they work with other allies. And nobody asks them. And then there's a little black intelligence service. I think one time it was called the C Shop, where there's the guys who write the intelligence for our boys who do stuff like in Norway. That's a separate wing. The way it works is the guys in Norway are known to themselves. The head of the CIA may know they're there, but if he asks, should I know more? They'd say no, and he'd say, okay. The White House only knows something's going on. That's the way it should be, and that's the way it was run. But they're not asked. So here's a White House that's, talking about the Russians might have done it, and there's an investigation in Denmark and Sweden. But the White House isn't asking anybody in its own agency, which does superb work. They intercept, we have all access to all the communications. Don't believe we stopped collecting stuff from Europe. Please don't believe that. From your people. Everybody monitors everybody. The Merkel thing was pretty bad because it got exposed when she was overheard, but never asked. So ask a smart guy inside, as I have. So why didn't they ask? And the answer is, well, because they knew the answer. Why would you ask the community to do something and have them find out what we know? We know we did it.
Right.
But
So
the press doesn't even think that way, because I don't know why.
So all things point to this. This is the biggest open secret to everybody in the community. There's no doubt to anybody who's anywhere near this that the U.S. did this, from pipeline people to anybody.
The pipeline people and the people who were involved working with the companies, don't forget it was a huge, big enterprise that put 1,500 miles of pipe underwater. And there was a big community, and they had a lot of people they hired to represent them in Washington, and a lot of very good oil people worked for them. And also all the poobahs that own the companies that finance the piping is usually done through you'll go to some major slush fund and get money from them, an investment corporation. But basically, I know I have physical reason to know things in my hand that they all understood right away it was Russia. It was not Russia, because that made no sense. They all understood the only player was, I don't know, is Montenegro part of, I always keep forgetting to look, is Montenegro part of NATO? Maybe not. Montenegro did it by itself, but I can guarantee you NATO didn't do it, because they'd be shooting themselves in the foot.
Right.
And so anyway, there you are. You've asked the right question.
I had a question from former guest of mine. His name is Jim Rickards. He was a ex-CIA advisor, writes a lot of books about money and about global supplies. And he said this. He said, isn't the sabotage of Nord Stream tantamount to an act of war by the U.S. against Germany? Even if Olaf Scholz approved the attack, isn't that an act of treason against his own country? Lastly, he asked, how long will the German people be expected to act as U.S. flunkies? I'm curious what you say about that. I hear Olaf is headed to D.C. in the next week or two.
Well, there was, I've been in touch, I've been talked to, there's a lot of groups that are doing investigations. And some of them are even, some of the major universities are doing ad hoc stuff, because it's so obvious. I have no way of knowing what Schultz was told or not. He was with the president. When Biden made that blunt statement, we will stop it, we can, he was there. He then said something that I did not put in the article, because what he said was, I support America and all that. I didn't want to suggest that he was saying he agreed with him about what was going on, because I don't know. It's a question he's going to have to answer. I hear he's coming to Washington in maybe next week, like a good puppy dog. I don't know. They'll do the song and dance.
Right.
He'll deny any knowledge. The problem is that the White House is in the position of the only thing they can do to salvage something in this mess they've made is deny it. So
Right.
they're never going to admit it.
Right.
It just won't happen. It'll be one of the great mysteries of the Western civilization.
And
how they anyway.
And ultimately, it was probably a smart power move, because they've shown their strength. And like you said, Biden's popularity has gone up. It's probably his only chance of winning an election is by doing this. Of course, 2 days ago, he shows up in Ukraine, in Kiev, next to Zelensky with his sunglasses on, walking around. I mean, it all seems to be going along the same lines of, this is the way to get reelected. I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, the thing I published today was about Lyndon Johnson, and Norwegians working with us, and Johnson lying to start the war. And when there's only a 4-minute speech. I actually have the whole speech. You could listen to it if you wanted to on the thing. There was a link to it, and I'm a Vietnam War junkie. I mean, once you start doing My Lai, I've been looking at things in Vietnam since then, and I learned something 5 years ago that I didn't know, and I've been working. COVID slowed up everything, but I'll tell you. The number killed in Vietnam usually is put between 2 and 3 million, as if there's not much difference. I can't believe the implicit racism of that, but that's another thought. But the Johnson speech, he lied about everything. He claimed that the North Vietnamese did something they didn't do, and he claimed they were doing it all the time. When really, our SEALs have been working in there, going after radar stuff. We even had a couple of SEALs wounded in North Vietnam, and they managed to get to the coast where they were rescued. And by the way, and won the Medal of Honor in secrecy. I wrote about that today. The show mendacity usually can work when a president does it, but look what happened to us when Johnson gave that speech in '54. You had 58,000 Americans killed, and you had 2 to 3 million Vietnamese. That's the number. We don't know the number killed. We know that many died. How many were directly from the war? Died because of being involved or in the area where the war was. Some died of old age, I'm sure, too, but not many. There are a lot of killing. And so when you look at it that way, you say to yourself, what are these guys doing? wagging a finger in the face of a Chinese in public, provoking the Chinese, pushing hard. Putin 2 days ago announced he was going to put all of his nuclear subs on full alert. Wow.
Yeah.
Where are we going with this? What does he want?
And what? Yeah.
Does he want the election? I'm serious. What does he want out of this?
What does Biden want out of this? Is that what you're asking? Yeah, he wants to get reelected. That's all. I think, just my opinion, I think that's all people in political power care about. I ran to be mayor of London a few years ago on a whim, and I got a small glimpse into that world. And that is the most important thing for anybody in that office. It's the next election, and they will do what it takes to get it. And they seem to be very myopic in order to make that happen. Just really quickly, Seymour, there's an incredible film, which I'm sure you've seen, called The Fog of War, where Robert McNamara talks about so many things you speak about from the Vietnam War. And he ends that movie talking about nuclear war. And I think he had, by chance, gotten an opportunity to bump into Castro, I think, many years later, and talking about talking about the standoff there. And I think he asked him, he said, would you have launched those missiles? And he said, yes, I would have. And he said, how could you even say that to me, that you would have started a thermonuclear war based on just coming to a head in that situation, knowing all the death it would have caused? And his final message to everyone was, you need to be very, very careful about these weapons we have, because people in certain circumstances are apt to deploy them without really understanding the ramifications. And it feels like we're coming very close to that now.
Whew. It's so funny you say that, because when I did the My Lai stuff, it was Harper's Magazine then did a 35-page excerpt from my book. I published a book on it that came in different stock and sold who knows X hundreds more thousands, and it was a big deal. And when that came out, McNamara's son, he had a son and daughter that were against the war. This is a very tortured man who did what I'm telling you, what Johnson did, lied about everything. McNamara was with him on that line. He wanted that war as much as anything. In 1964, he wanted to go and get the commies. I don't know what it's about, but his son called me and said, in tears pretty much, I'm in the phone book. It's 1969, and he said, when the article came, Dad works after dinner in his library, and I left it on his table in the library after dinner before he went in, and when he went to sleep, like an 18, 19-year-old kid, he was probably listening to the top 10 music, what kids do, smoking a joint. I don't know what they did those days. Anyway, he went down and it was in the fireplace, and he called me to say how upset he was about it. So years later, 30 years, 40 years later, I go to Vietnam finally, because I didn't want to go. I just didn't want to see that there was a ditch where everybody was killed that I wrote about. That just, I couldn't, you can't imagine as an American to see what our boys did. And there was much more going on there that I finally learned. But anyway, and so I went, and when I went back, I called the son. I told him I went back, and I went back there and I said, just wanted to talk about it. He didn't remember calling me, but he did dispute it. And then he said to me, I asked him if he was very alienated from his father. And I asked, he's a lovely kid, runs a walnut farm in California, very high end. And I asked him if he didn't dispute that happened. He knew how angry he was. And he said, when my father I made up with my father before he died. And he said, I was with him the moment he passed away. And this is the former head of Ford Motor Company, a very sure guy, a very big star of the Kennedy years. He said, my dad asked me, he said, do you think God will accept me for what I've done? And I said, yes. And I told him that was the right thing to say. How could you not say that? But very moving. Will God accept me? Because he knew there's a lot of souls in his life. You know what I think about? I was in the Army. And I was a terrible soldier. I had to avoid the draft because I'd gone to long school and bounced out of there so fast it wasn't funny. I hated law, but I wasn't dumb. I knew I wasn't dumb, but I worked as a bar. You do those things. I didn't go to Harvard or Yale, and I wasn't editor of the Harvard Yale, or the Harvard Crimson or the Yale Daily News. My father died of cancer when I was 16, and he ran a ghetto business in the black part of Chicago, and I ran it while going to college. I was When I got to the Washington Bureau, I was the strangest thing they'd ever seen. I didn't belong. I didn't belong to an eating club. I'm only exaggerating slightly. Anyway, and so I can leave all these stories out. You don't need to know them all. But
Yeah, I think McNamara, you can tell in that movie, he's tortured by a lot of the things that he had, the decisions he made.
Well, I'll tell you one thing he did. He always answered every call I gave him after that.
Really?
Right away.
Wow.
And he did, I mean, I don't know if that was a way of solace, but I always could talk to him, and the regret was there in a way. You know, it's got to be on your soul when you have a war that awful.
And so are we approaching something very dangerous? I mean, it seems like the Biden administration has an agenda. They're going all in on Ukraine, even though, like you said, it doesn't make sense. It was notoriously not a regime that we liked or wanted to support or we thought was corrupt. And now it's putting us on this head-on collision to Russia. Meanwhile, the mainstream media has seemed to decided to just go with whatever the administration is saying and not even report the facts of what's happening in Ukraine.
Well, but even the way they handled the communiques, covering the Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, went to China after refusing to go because of balloons. We can deal with that some other time. But The whole story of that is comical, really comical.
Are you going to do a piece on what really happened with the balloons?
No, because it's too trivial. But I will tell you, there were contracts given to the University of Fairbanks in northern Alaska. They needed coverage over when most of the major airlines go from Asia to America over the North Pole. Yeah. There's no weather station there. And the pilots, even though at 30,000 feet, it'd be nice to know if there was a sudden downdraft or something going on below. They needed to know. So the Fairbanks got this contract to send up balloon type things. They were vehicles, really. That's what they shot down to monitor the weather. They had a federal contract. The government paid for that. And of course, nobody's talking about that.
They shot it down by accident, or they shot it down to make it look like they were doing something?
I don't know what they did.
Okay.
I have no idea what they were doing. But anything to make a fight with China, that's the way it goes.
Does it surprise you, Seymour, that an 85-year-old guy writing on Substack can break something that shocks the world?
I didn't know how powerful Substack was. I have a friend, Matt Taibbi, who writes a lot for Substack, and he was telling me, he pushed me into it. He said, it's amazing. And I will tell you, it's a very discerning crowd, because a lot of people have been waiting to somebody to explicate the Gulf thing. It was just a mystery. I don't know why my own newspaper, I've said privately to somebody I know there, and I've said not that much, only a couple of times.
It was New York Times.
I mentioned
that
the pipeline people know something, but nobody's chasing it. It's just, and look, do I see the Democrats, as I said, having a hearing on it? When we were in My Lai days, the Democrats were against trying to stop the war, with a lot of Republicans. There were moderate Republicans that were just fantastic then. You had a real group of legislators who understood, again, that we were going in a death spiral there, not only to our own people, but to a lot of people in Asia. And by the way, if you want to know about containment, if you looked at what happened in Saigon in 1975, Saigon fell. And a couple of weeks later, Cambodia fell. Communists took over, crazies. And a couple of weeks after that, Vientiane and Laos fell. So the whole purpose that we gave for explaining the war was it was to contain Red China and North Vietnam, contain the communists. And so everything we were fighting for collapsed within a month. And guess what happened? Nothing. They all became eventually, we're the largest trading partner of Vietnam now, which used to be North Viet, was the North one. The country's unified. Nothing happened. So all that stuff we were doing, containing China, who lost the whole notion of containment, that's what I've been looking at. It falls on its head. It was just wrong. And so when David Halberstam was a wonderful guy and a friend of mine, wrote a book called The Best and the Brightest. And I always wondered, because they weren't that bright. They may have been the first in their class at Harvard, but in the real world, they like McNamara, who's head of Ford, was a whiz kid. They had no common sense when it came down to it. But I understand now that title was sarcastic. I wish David died long ago, and I wish I could have asked him about it.
So
Anyway, there
this
we go.
this policy of containment. Would you look at would you look at our treatment of Ukraine through that same lens? Are we fighting a battle that we're going to look at 50 years from now and say that was just ridiculous? You can't
Well, of course.
you can't push something uphill. You can't stop.
Every business knows if you go do anything in Ukraine, the first thing you have to do is start paying off everybody.
Right.
And I will tell you that the rap on Zelensky, Zelensky's not unaware of the money to be made from American. Let's just put it that I don't want to say something that I shouldn't, but just because it's none of my business. But the corruption there it goes up to the top, and he's been told cut it out, and I don't understand. I don't understand. It's clear that the Ukraine army has been eviscerated, and the people are suffering terribly. And he's keeping on going, and Biden's keeping on going instead of pushing like a mother for peace. Your Boris Johnson did his thing. I think it's pretty clear in March or April when he screwed up some peace talks that were underway. The Turks were doing peace talks, and Erdogan, who I don't like at all because he's very undemocratic. Erdogan is keeping Sweden out of the NATO because I'm sure he's enraged at the fact that he had something going and we blew it in the spring with the Russians, because he has good contacts. He was taking oil from Russia, excess oil. Russia's done fine. Their economy's in a downfall. Inflation's high, the same as it is here, but it's not as bad as in the rest of the world. Certainly not as bad as in the UK, and he's certainly holding on.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.